When psychologists study human behavior, they often discover something surprising. Two people can perform the exact same action, yet be driven by completely different motivations. And that's exactly what happens with empaths. Most people enter social interactions with at least some awareness of influence. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's subtle, but the thought exists. How do I come across? Do they like me? How can I make a good impression? How can I be more attractive? How can I get this person interested in me? Whether consciously or unconsciously, a large percentage of people are monitoring their effect on others. They're paying attention to reactions. They're watching for signs of attraction. They're adjusting their behavior based on feedback. In other words, part of their attention is focused outward, but another part is focused on themselves, on their image, their influence, their impact. Empaths often operate differently. When they enter a conversation, their attention tends to move in another direction entirely. Instead of asking, "How do I affect this person?" they unconsciously ask, "How does this person feel?" That one difference changes everything, because attention shapes behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. Imagine two people sitting across from the same stranger. The first person is trying to build attraction. They're noticing body language, they're measuring interest, they're thinking about what to say next, they're trying to create a certain impression. The second person is an empath. They're noticing emotions, subtle shifts in energy, moments of discomfort, hidden insecurities, things left unsaid. They're not focused on creating a reaction, they're focused on understanding a reality. And that's why so many empaths miss opportunities for seduction without even realizing it. Not because they lack the ability, but because they're playing a completely different game. Think about how often attraction involves attention. Not attention toward the other person, attention toward the effect you're having on them. Seductive personalities constantly track this. They're watching for clues, signs, signals, openings, possibilities. Empaths often don't. Not because they're incapable, but because their minds are occupied elsewhere. Their curiosity is directed inward, toward the emotional world of the other person. And here's where things become fascinating. Most people assume seduction begins with confidence, but confidence isn't the first step. Awareness is. You can't intentionally influence a reaction if you're not paying attention to the reaction in the first place. And many empaths simply aren't. They're listening, observing, understanding, connecting. While everyone else is tracking attraction, the empath is tracking emotion. This creates one of the biggest blind spots in empath psychology. Many empaths don't realize when someone is interested in them. Not immediately. Sometimes not for weeks. Sometimes not at all. Friends notice it. Coworkers notice it. Even strangers notice it. Yet the empath remains completely unaware. Why? Because attraction signals often look very different from emotional signals. And empaths naturally prioritize emotional information. Someone might be flirting. The empath sees vulnerability. Someone might be pursuing them. The empath sees friendliness. Someone might be trying to create romantic tension. The empath sees emotional openness. In other words, they interpret the interaction through a completely different lens. This isn't a flaw, it's a preference of attention. And attention determines what enters awareness. What most people don't realize is that seduction requires a certain relationship with influence, not manipulation, influence. You must be willing to affect another person's emotional state. You must be willing to create anticipation, curiosity, desire, interest. You must recognize your impact and then consciously participate in it. Many empaths hesitate at this stage, not because they can't do it, but because something inside them feels uncomfortable. Their instinct isn't to guide emotions. Their instinct is to understand emotions. There's a difference, a subtle but important difference. One approach asks, how can I move this interaction in a certain direction? The other asks, what is genuinely happening here? Empaths naturally gravitate toward the second question, and because of that, they often overlook the first. This becomes especially obvious when attraction starts developing. Most people notice attraction and begin responding to it. Empaths often notice connection and stay focused there. They continue learning, listening, understanding. Meanwhile, the attraction grows unnoticed in the background. The irony is almost unbelievable. Many empaths possess qualities that naturally attract people, yet they rarely think of themselves as influential. They rarely see themselves as seductive. They rarely recognize the emotional effect they have, because in their minds they're simply being authentic, simply being present, simply being themselves. But authenticity doesn't feel like power when it comes naturally. It feels normal, and what feels normal often becomes invisible. That's why so many empaths underestimate themselves. They assume everyone notices what they notice, feels what they feel, cares about what they care about. But that's not true. The average person walks into a room focused on entirely different things, different goals, different priorities, different motivations. The empath is often operating from an entirely different psychological framework, and that framework creates a hidden conflict. Because sooner or later, the empath becomes aware of their influence. They begin noticing attraction, interest, attention. They realize people are responding to them in ways they never expected. But instead of embracing that influence, many empaths experience something else. Something that stops them before they ever become truly seductive. Something that makes emotional tension feel uncomfortable. Something that causes them to remove attraction rather than build it. And once you understand that mechanism, the entire mystery starts making sense. Because the biggest reason empaths rarely seduce others has nothing to do with confidence, nothing to do with looks, and nothing to do with social skill. It has everything to do with what they instinctively do whenever emotional tension begins to appear. And that's where the story becomes even more interesting. Why emotional tension feels wrong to them. Most people think attraction grows through connection, and they're right. But that's only part of the story. Because attraction and connection are not exactly the same thing. Connection creates closeness, attraction creates pull. And the bridge between those two experiences is often something many empaths unintentionally eliminate: emotional tension. The word tension sounds negative. It sounds uncomfortable. It sounds like conflict. But in psychology, emotional tension simply means uncertainty. The space between knowing and not knowing. The space between interest and confirmation. The space where curiosity begins to grow. Think about the early stages of attraction. Before anyone admits their feelings, before anything becomes official, before intentions are clearly stated, there is usually uncertainty, questions, wondering, anticipation. The mind starts filling in gaps, and those gaps create emotional energy. This is why people replay conversations in their heads, why they keep checking their phones, why they think about someone long after the interaction ends. Their brain is trying to resolve uncertainty, and the process itself creates emotional investment. But here's where empaths become different. Empaths have a powerful instinct. Whenever they sense discomfort in another person, they try to reduce it. Whenever they sense confusion, they try to clarify it. Whenever they sense insecurity, they try to soothe it. Whenever they sense emotional tension, they try to resolve it. And while that instinct makes them compassionate, it often works against seduction. Because seduction doesn't always grow from certainty. Sometimes it grows from anticipation. Imagine someone is becoming attracted to an empath. They're curious, interested, trying to figure them out, wondering how the empath feels, wondering what happens next. In many situations, that uncertainty naturally creates attraction. But the empath senses the uncertainty and immediately tries to make the other person comfortable. They explain everything, clarify everything, reassure everything. Suddenly the mystery disappears, the anticipation disappears, the emotional tension disappears, and with it, a significant part of the attraction process disappears too. The empath usually has no idea this happened. In their mind, they were simply being kind, simply being honest, simply making things easier. But attraction isn't always strengthened by making things easier. Sometimes it's strengthened by allowing emotional space to exist. That's a difficult concept for many empaths, because they genuinely dislike seeing people uncomfortable. They dislike emotional confusion. They dislike emotional games. They dislike manipulation. So whenever they notice uncertainty emerging, they rush to eliminate it. What they don't realize is that uncertainty and manipulation are not the same thing. Healthy attraction contains uncertainty. Manipulation exploits uncertainty. Those are very different things. Yet many empaths unconsciously treat them as identical. As a result, they avoid creating any emotional tension at all. This creates a fascinating pattern. A person becomes interested in the empath. The empath senses something changing. Then, instead of allowing the attraction to develop naturally, they shift the interaction into safety mode. Everything becomes predictable. Everything becomes clear. Everything becomes emotionally secure. The result? The relationship often feels comfortable, but less exciting. Connected, but less magnetic. Close, but less intriguing. This is one of the reasons many empaths find themselves hearing similar comments throughout life. "You're such a great person. I feel so comfortable around you. I can tell you anything. I've never met anyone like you." These sound like compliments, and they are. But notice something interesting. Many of those statements describe emotional safety, not attraction. Safety and attraction often work together, but they aren't identical. One creates trust. The other creates desire. The strongest relationships contain both. Yet empaths often become experts at one while unintentionally neglecting the other. And the reason goes deeper than most people realize, because many empaths have an unusually strong sensitivity to power. Not physical power, emotional power. They know what it feels like to be manipulated. They know what it feels like to be misunderstood. They know what it feels like when someone uses emotions irresponsibly. Because of that, they become extremely cautious about influencing others, sometimes too cautious. They begin treating their own influence as something dangerous, something they should avoid, something they should never consciously use. This creates an internal conflict. The moment attraction starts forming, part of the empath becomes uncomfortable. Not because attraction is wrong, but because influence feels risky. They don't want to pressure anyone. They don't want to mislead anyone. They don't want to create false expectations. So they move toward complete transparency, complete clarity, complete emotional certainty. Again, those qualities are wonderful in many situations. But attraction rarely begins in complete certainty. It begins in discovery, in curiosity, in possibility, in the gradual process of learning someone. And when that process gets rushed, something important gets lost. The irony is almost painful. Empaths often believe they're protecting the connection, yet sometimes they're accidentally removing the very emotional energy that helps the connection grow. Not intentionally, not maliciously, simply because their instincts prioritize comfort over curiosity, resolution over anticipation, security over mystery. And that brings us to the biggest misunderstanding of all. Many empaths assume that people who are naturally seductive possess something they don't. More confidence, more charisma, more charm, more attractiveness. But that's not necessarily true. In many cases, those people simply have a different relationship with emotional tension. They're comfortable allowing curiosity to exist, comfortable allowing uncertainty to exist, comfortable allowing attraction to develop without immediately resolving it. Meanwhile, the empath is busy making sure everyone feels safe. And while that's admirable, it often prevents them from seeing a remarkable truth. The truth is that they already possess many of the qualities that create deep attraction. In fact, some of the most powerful attractive qualities a person can have. The problem is that they don't recognize those qualities as power. They think they're just being themselves. They think they're just being kind. They think they're just being authentic. What they fail to see is that authenticity itself can be incredibly influential. And once an empath finally understands that, their entire view of attraction begins to change. Because the final piece of the puzzle isn't about what empaths lack. It's about what they've had all along without realizing it. The power they have but rarely see. If you followed the journey so far, you might think this video is saying that empaths fail at attraction, that they somehow lack the qualities needed to create desire. But that's not the conclusion at all. In fact, the truth is almost the opposite. The real mystery isn't why empaths can't seduce. The real mystery is why so many of them never realize how naturally influential they already are. Because when most people hear the word seduction, they imagine techniques, strategies, body language, flirting, charm, psychological tricks, ways of creating attraction in another person. But here's what many empaths miss. The strongest forms of attraction often happen long before any of those things enter the picture. Think about the people who leave the deepest impressions on your life. Not necessarily the most attractive, not necessarily the most charismatic, not necessarily the loudest, but the ones you never forgot. The ones who seemed different. The ones who felt real. The ones who made you feel more like yourself. That kind of influence is difficult to manufacture because it doesn't come from performance. It comes from presence. And presence is one of the empath's greatest strengths. The problem is that empaths rarely view presence as power. They view it as normal. They assume everyone listens deeply. Everyone notices emotional details. Everyone cares about authenticity. Everyone values meaningful connection. But the reality is very different. Many people spend years searching for emotional experiences that come naturally to an empath. Years searching for genuine understanding. Years searching for someone who feels emotionally safe. Years searching for conversations that don't feel superficial. And when they encounter those qualities, they often experience something powerful, something memorable, something attractive. Yet the empath frequently misses this entirely because they're measuring themselves by the wrong standards. They compare themselves to people who are more flirtatious, more socially bold, more expressive, more obviously attractive. And because they don't resemble those people, they assume they have less influence. But influence comes in many forms. Some people attract attention. Others attract trust. Some attract excitement. Others attract emotional depth. The mistake many empaths make is assuming only one form matters. As a result, they overlook the effect they have on people. They underestimate the emotional space they create. They underestimate the comfort they create. They underestimate the sense of being understood that follows them wherever they go. And because they underestimate it, they never learn how powerful it actually is. This becomes especially obvious as empaths mature. Something interesting tends to happen over time. The younger empath often spends years trying to prove themselves, trying to earn love, trying to earn acceptance, trying to earn belonging. They give more, help more, sacrifice more. They believe their value comes from what they provide. But eventually life teaches them something, usually through disappointment, usually through heartbreak, usually through relationships that felt one-sided. They discover that constantly proving your value doesn't make people value you more. Sometimes it simply teaches people to expect more from you, and that's when a shift begins. A subtle shift at first, then a profound one. The empath starts paying attention to their own needs, their own energy, their own boundaries, their own emotional reality. For perhaps the first time in their life, they stop making everyone else the center of the story, and something unexpected happens. Their presence changes, not because they're becoming colder, not because they're becoming selfish, but because they're becoming aware of their worth, aware of their impact, aware of their influence. This awareness creates something many empaths have lacked for years: choice. Before, they gave attention automatically. Now they choose where it goes. Before, they offered unlimited access. Now they become selective. Before, they focused entirely on understanding others. Now they understand themselves too. And strangely enough, this is often the moment people start noticing them differently. Not because the empath learned manipulation, not because they mastered seduction techniques, but because self-respect changed the energy they bring into every interaction. People can feel when someone values themselves, just as they can feel when someone doesn't. And self-respect has a unique effect on attraction. It removes desperation. It removes over-explaining. It removes the need to constantly prove worth. The empath stops chasing connection and starts allowing connection. That's a very different experience. Perhaps this is the greatest irony of all. The empath spent years believing seductive people possessed some secret ability, some hidden advantage, some mysterious power, only to discover that genuine influence was never about controlling emotions. It was about understanding them, not about creating a false image, but about becoming comfortable with the truth of who you are. And once an empath reaches that point, something remarkable happens. They no longer need to seduce. They no longer need to convince. They no longer need to perform, because the qualities they once overlooked begin speaking for themselves. Their authenticity, their depth, their emotional awareness, their presence, their ability to make people feel seen. Those qualities become visible in a new way, not because they suddenly appeared, but because the empath finally recognized them. And maybe that's the answer hidden inside the title of this video. The reason 99% of empaths never seduce isn't because they're incapable of attraction. It's because they're usually focused on understanding rather than influencing, on connection rather than strategy, on truth rather than performance. They spend so much time seeing into others that they rarely stop to see themselves. And that's why they don't even realize it. Not because they lack power, but because they never learned to recognize the kind of power they already had all along.